Welcome back to Coffee with Gish. Another day, another opportunity to geek out about Mormonism. The Mormon temple is something that I'm extremely interested in, and I will probably be interested in for the rest of my life. I had an amazing experience my first time going through the temple. I wasn't the biggest temple attender, but when I did go, I enjoyed it very much. And I thought about it a whole lot. As a student of Hugh Nibley, I certainly thought about it a lot. I thought about, and I continue to think about how the church deals with the issue of the temple. And it's obviously something that's in the news for a couple of reasons now. Number one, there have been some conflicts between the church and smaller communities where the church plans to build temples. Fairview, Texas, I hope I have that right, where the church was, I guess, initially denied permission by the planning board to deny permission to build their temple. At least a temple according to the church's specifications in this small community in the residential area. So that conflict, and this is not the first time it's happened. It's happening. It's happened a couple of times now, where the church has wanted to build a temple in a particular area in a small town, and there's been blowback from the town. They haven't really wanted the church to build the size and kind of building that the church wanted to build in that particular spot. It's a complicated issue. I don't want to get into it. I understand something about the perspectives of both sides. I will say that I tend to fall down on the side of doing what we can to be good neighbors in a place where we move in. So I know that is a kind of bias, and I have to own that. I certainly believe in the right of LDS people to be able to worship. It's part of their freedom of religion in this country, and I stand by that. But on the other hand, I think it's important to make some effort, I think, to be a good neighbor, especially when you're a large organization coming into a small community. This is not an unusual problem, and it's not just a problem that churches have. Other kinds of organizations, like major corporations, will get some pushback from small communities that don't want a big box retailer in their town or something like that. So this is the kind of problem that Americans are dealing with in small towns all across the country. People are very sensitive about issues of zoning and zoning regulations, and large entities with a lot of money that can employ lawyers. They'll use the power that they have, and it's legal power. You have to remember it is legal for the church to employ attorneys and to try to argue its case and get its way. That's part of the system. But on the community side, it's kind of tough to feel like you're being bulldozed by someone who is, in a sense, coming from the outside and seems to be dictating to you what your town should be like. So that's one reason why temples are in the news. The other thing, of course, is the changes to the temple. And obviously, I have very strong feelings and opinions about that, but I'd like to emphasize that I'm not advocating for or against it. The temple changes are not, in a sense, my business anymore, as I'm not affiliating with the LDS Church any longer. I'm not criticizing the church for making these changes. It's completely their prerogative to do so. But of course, I have feelings and opinions about it, and I want to share those in as neutral and even-keeled manner as I can, with no intent to insult faithful LDS people who go to the temple and enjoy it and will continue to do so, continue to enjoy it and be enriched by that experience in their lives. I hope they do continue to do it and to enjoy that experience, that special blessing, as in language they might use. Well, actually, the topic I want to talk about today is something a little bit different, but it takes us back to the earliest days of Mormonism. Here I'm talking about the early 1830s, and the subject is one of charismatic worship. Now, if you go to an LDS church today, I'm not trying to be too critical here or anything, but if you're not used to it, you might be a little bit bored, maybe. Um, as a missionary, I would take my investigators, they were called, people who were looking into the church that we were teaching missionary lessons to. I would take investigators to church, and I got a variety of reactions from people that I took, and sometimes those reactions weren't very positive. I remember one of our investigators, this lovely woman, single mother, had two daughters and teenage daughters, and she was looking for a new religious community. I think in some ways she wasn't happy with her Catholic experience, but she definitely came from this grown up in the Catholic Church kind of experience, and she was responding well to the lessons. Her daughters were responding well to the lessons, and so it came time to invite her to come to an LDS meeting on Sunday. So we were so excited. Missionaries, of course, don't often have the opportunity to take their investigators to church. So it's a big deal when you have enough success with an investigator that the lessons are going so well, and you're looking at a possible baptism coming up. You know, you're excited when you invite someone to church and they accept, but then you're a little bit nervous. You're thinking, okay, now we have them coming, but how are they going to react to what they see? Of course, we as missionaries, we're very used to what goes on in church. But it's interesting. The mission field gives us a chance to sort of step out of that emic or insider perspective on the faith and start to consider what it may look like to outsiders. And in this particular case, our interactions with this investigator, their progress toward making a commitment to be baptized, was suddenly derailed by their very negative experience with attending a church meeting on Sunday. So what happened? Why was it that this person who's excited, looking for a church, excited about the lessons, excited about what we were teaching, who was so enthusiastic and optimistic, and moving in the direction of baptism, that they would agree to come to church? What would make that person suddenly, on going to church, basically stop the whole process dead in its tracks? Well, I would say it was her Catholic background. And what I mean by that is, nothing wrong with being Catholic, but Catholic services are so different from Mormon services that she found Mormon services very distasteful, and she didn't want to continue with the process. What was it that really got her goat? What is it that really upset her, and I would say even offended her? Well, when the sacrament was passed, okay, the sacrament is the Mormon communion. It's blessed by older teenage young men called priests. It's passed by teenage young men, young teens, called deacons. But the sacrament, or what you would think of perhaps as communion, was being passed around. And here, this woman saw a bunch of adults who looked bored, listless, sometimes restless. But I'll never forget the particular image that set her off, and it was an adult woman holding her daughter's Barbie and twirling it by one of its limbs. And I've done that before with a Barbie doll, visiting with, uh, you know, a young girl when I was a little boy, taking her Barbie, taking one of its legs and, sort of whipping it around a little bit. And I could just see that image when she described it. And when she was so upset and so horrified that I was kind of heartbroken. And I had a hard time. Of course, I wasn't expecting this. I was devastated. Everything had been going so well. We were looking forward to asking them to commit to be baptized, and then that was it. It was done. And I had to say, I felt like she had a point. Now, why was this happening? Well, I think it's because um, in an LDS ward, it's so family oriented that it's really more about the family being together when you do the ordinance rather than the attitude that people have about the ordinance. And this is not to say that people are generally irreverent. And I'm sure the woman who was idly flipping the Barbie around by its leg, she wasn't intending to be irreverent or disrespectful. I just don't think she had any concept that someone on the outside would look in and see this as an irreverent and disrespectful act in what should be a very sacred moment. And now you have to understand, as I've said in earlier episodes, now from a Catholic's perspective, Mass is the thing. That's why you're going to church, to partake of the Mass, which is the body and blood of Christ. And it's in a way, you might say it's the peak, most sacred experience in all of Catholicism. Now, I'm not Catholic, I admit. Any Catholic who wants to come along and correct me on this, I'm just trying to understand this from the little bit I know and from this investigator's reaction. Well, that was a tough experience as a missionary, but it was a learning experience. And since I returned from my mission, and I've studied the history of LDS worship just a little bit, I'm aware that over time LDS worship services have changed, and attitudes have changed, and practices have changed. And I think all along, LDS people are very generally reverent and sincere, and they do meditate during the passing of the sacrament about repentance, overcoming sin, of the forgiveness that comes through the atonement of Jesus Christ. That's the language that they would use, and so I've got no doubt about that. But the whole situation, all the tension around that, the big feelings that I saw during my mission with people who were joining the church and getting accustomed to, or maybe deciding not to get accustomed to LDS worship services, that has, sparked a historical interest in me. And one thing that I've learned over time is that in the earliest Mormon meetings, you might say, there was a heck of a lot more charismatic Pentecostal fervor, which is surprising. The woman flipping the Barbie mindlessly or maybe absent-mindedly while she's waiting for the sacrament to be passed for that's not, or just the silence. There's really in an LDS ward, that's what a congregation is called, the general mood is quiet and reflective, and that's where a lot of spirituality in Mormonism is found today. It's in quiet reflection during meetings. Some people might call them boring. I know I've called them boring in my more peevish and sour moments. I thought, boy, I wish this could be a little bit more exciting or lively or engaging in some way. That's just me. I know that others are very much engaged and appreciative of the sense of spiritual feeling that they get in the worship service. But that's nothing. When you hear these early descriptions of Mormon meetings, you might be shocked. Now, I have two perspectives here. One of them comes from an early convert who didn't stay in the church very long. His name is Ezra Booth, and he wrote a series of letters to a reverend. And they're critical. They're critical of Mormonism. I mean, this is a guy who converted and left, and so you have to understand. You have to take what he's saying with a grain of salt. Be critical and by critical I mean, know the source here, know his perspective, and don't just swallow what he's saying hook, line, and sinker. I don't think he's lying, but you can tell the truth in a way that's slanted enough that it makes the facts look bad. It makes it, it's almost an insulting way of describing what someone in the situation might have felt very lofty and spiritual about. The second source that I'm going to read is from the history of John Whitmer, who was one of the earliest members of the church, another very early member of the church, who was the church's first historian. Now, again, John Whitmer left the church. He stayed in it a lot longer than Ezra Booth did, but he left the church. So, unfortunately, I'm relying on two sources that, from an apologetic perspective, might be easily dismissed because they're from former members of the Mormon Church. I don't think that we can, however, just dismiss things dismiss them completely because they come from people who are no longer insiders, no longer sympathetic. They're still witnesses of facts. They may be slanted witnesses to facts. They may describe things in a disparaging way. We certainly can't take everything they say at face value, but we also can't, just kick them out the door. I'll give you an example. I spoke a few years ago at Sunstone. I think it was the second to last time I spoke at Sunstone, and it was in a session, a panel that was on the Book of Mormon as almost like a sacred relic. Because I think it is. The golden plates that Joseph Smith found through angelic ministration, it's a sacred object. And, there are lots of replicas that are made. Not lots, but there are replicas out there. And it's always kind of neat to think of what the gold plates may have looked like. So I was on this panel, and the panel was the panel respondent. Sometimes panels or a group of speakers will have a prominent scholar or a very experienced scholar come in and respond to the papers. Well, we had responding to our panel, and to this day I can't believe it, but one of the most eminent scholars of religion in North America, in the world, has responded to our panel. And to my horror, this prominent professor raked my paper over the coals, was very dismissive of my paper. And that was kind of a humiliating moment to have this very prominent scholar be very critical of my work. I won't name the scholar. I'm sure you could hunt it out if you want to. This is just a person whose approach to things was very much different from my own. Essentially, the message from the scholar was, your work isn't religious studies. And I thought, well, yeah, I'm a historian. I don't do religious studies. I'm a historian. And what I like to do with Mormonism, as I hope you're learning, or at least part of what I like to do, is put things in a larger historical context. Well, this particular scholar mistook what I was doing for almost a kind of theologizing, where She believed that in the mode of Hugh Nibley, and I admit that I'm influenced by Hugh Nibley, but I don't follow his methodology in my work. But like Hugh Nibley, I was trying to use the past to justify the present. I think that was part of it. Although I can't put words in this person's mouth. I don't really think everything that this esteemed professor, and I got along fine with the professor. We talked afterward. Everything is fine. But I was accused of theologizing. Well, in my point of view, I'm not theologizing at all. I'm placing things in a historical context. And so I was a little bit, I had a little bee in my bonnet or a burr in my britches. And I went up to her after the session and I said, yeah, I'm kind of confused here. I'm a historian and this is my training and this is what I was trying to do. And I talked to her about some of my sources. She said, well, yeah, but your sources are anti-Mormon. And I was like, what? I couldn't believe that a non-LDS scholar of religion was taking me to task for using anti-Mormon sources. Well, these were affidavits from the book Mormonism Unveiled. And yeah, they're critical sources. They have to be, you know, contextualized carefully. But it's not like everything in them is worthless. And it was a brief interaction. I don't. This was my reaction to what was said in the moment. I'm sure if I had had time and we could have sat down and talked about things for hours, we could have had some better meeting of the minds, and I would understand what she was trying to say to me in her criticism, and she would understand what I was trying to do with my methodology. But it was that my takeaway at the moment was I was shocked that a historian would dismiss completely a critical source or a negative source, an anti-Mormon source, because that's not how I work. I think that even the detractors of a historical phenomenon or person, even people who are dead set against something, they have something of historical value that we can glean if we exercise our critical faculties appropriately, and maybe she just felt that I hadn't, and that's fair enough. We can always argue about the use of evidence, the appropriate use of primary sources. I'm big into that. And these are what I would consider here today primary sources that describe early Mormon worship in a very charismatic way. I'm going to start with Ezra Booth because his letter was written in October of 1831. So here is a first-person eyewitness viewer, a witness to early Mormon worship, some of the earliest Mormon worship. And he's explaining this from an unsympathetic perspective to someone else who he sees as a fellow opponent of the Mormon movement. So just keep that in mind. Quote, being carried away in the Spirit and, quote, I know it to be so by the Spirit, are well known, and I'll add here Mormon phrases, and in common use in the Mormonite church. That's what he's calling it now. Certainly in the church, they would not have called it the Mormonite church. We will first notice the gift of tongues, exercised by some when carried away in the Spirit. These persons were apparently lost to all surrounding circumstances and wrapped up in the contemplation of things and in communicating with persons not present. So, invisible spirits maybe, or angels. These people, articulated sounds, which but few present professed to understand, and those few declared them to be the Indian language. Okay, obviously referring to Native American languages, here using the outmoded term Indian. A merchant who had formerly been a member of the Methodist Society observed he had formerly traded with the Indians and he knew it to be their dialect. So here is witness to a miracle. Okay, now, and this is interesting, and this is one of the reasons why I think we can't just toss this out, right? Because even though he's critical, he's an important witness. If all he was interested in was discrediting Mormonism completely, and even if he is interested in just discrediting Mormonism completely, he's giving us some valid and valuable information here that someone speaks in an unknown tongue and then declares it to be the Indian language, and then somebody else who knows something about that, this Methodist, says, hey, yeah, that does sound like the Indian language to me. And now Booth talks about his own experience. Being myself present on some of these occasions. So he's an eyewitness. He was someone who's actually there. He's not relying on another person's opinion or observations. A person proffered his services as my interpreter when he was there and translated these sounds, which to me were unintelligible, into the English language. One individual could read any chapter of the Old or New Testament in several different languages. This was known to be the case by a person who professed to understand those languages. In the midst of this delirium, and there's that critical note there, that negative viewpoint, they would at times fancy themselves to be addressing a congregation of their, and I'm going to use some offensive language here, but it's his language, of their red brethren. They would fancy themselves addressing a congregation of their red brethren, and mounted up on a stump or the fence, or from some elevated situation would harangue their assembly until they had convinced and converted them. Now, if you know your Book of Mormon and Samuel the Lamanite, you're going to say, hey, we might be seeing the influence of the Book of Mormon text getting up in a high spot like a wall and preaching repentance to the people like Samuel the Lamanite. Until they had convinced and converted them. They would then lead them into the water and baptize them and pronounce their sins forgiven. In this exercise, some of them actually went into the water and in the water performed the ceremony used in baptizing. These actors assumed the visage of another offensive term, of the savage, and so nearly imitated him, not only in language but in gestures and actions, that it seemed the soul and body were completely metamorphosed into the Indian. Okay, now I find this to be absolutely fascinating. That his claim is that early Mormon worshipers were impersonating Native Americans in their Pentecostal or charismatic worship. No doubt was then entertained, but that this was an extraordinary work of the Lord. So that's taken as proof that this is the work of God, that they have become, they've taken on the look and the behavior of Native Americans, designed to prepare those young men for the Indian mission. And yeah, one of the early goals of Mormonism was to bring the Native American peoples to Christ, to convert them, to convince them that they were descended from the Israelites, and then to convert them to Christ. That was one of the main early Mormon missions. And many who are still leaders of the church, could say, quote, "We know by the Spirit that it is the work of the Lord." All right, so that's that. And again, to me, that's just mind-blowing. You would, to my knowledge, never see anything like that in an LDS worship service today. Of course, there's a lot of history between then and now. A lot of changes, and there were changes. This didn't last for very long. In fact, in this very letter, Ezra Booth talks about how this changed, and suddenly these same manifestations started to be criticized as possibly the influence of darker forces. Now, that's fascinating. Um, I think there is evidence to suggest that there were concerns about the source of these manifestations, and that the charismatic nature of Mormon worship started to moderate pretty quickly. In the Kirtland era in the 1830s, the mid to late 1830, like 1836, in association with the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, there were huge outpourings of miracles and spiritual manifestations. But then it kind of tails off, and the church is decidedly less charismatic from then on. Now, this doesn't mean that Mormonism is devoid of spiritual gifts and charismatic worship altogether, but it's a lot more subdued even today. And I think sort of charismatic leftover, as it were, in the Mormonism of today is the fast and testimony meeting, where people fast for 24 hours. They go to a sacrament meeting, and then they get up and bear their testimony. But they get up, and this is almost like a Quaker meeting in a way. They get up voluntarily and go up to the podium, to the mic, and they bear their testimony. And a lot of these testimonies sound pretty much the same. I'd like to bear my testimony. I know the church is true. I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet. I know that the present prophet is the leader of the church called by God, and he's our living prophet, and so forth. I mean, I basically got the script, at least from the time I was going, practically memorized. And I did this myself, and I felt that it was a very deeply spiritual and charismatic experience. The fruits of the Spirit that I was experiencing at the time. So it's not like spiritual manifestations have gone away. As a missionary, boy, sometime I will tell you about my missionary experience. That was, to use an outmoded expression, off the hook. There was so much going on in the spiritual and charismatic realm on my mission that it left an indelible mark on me. Things that today I would have a hard time really, I certainly wouldn't speak of them frequently. I may not even talk about them here, but it's kind of not where I am in my life anymore. So in some ways it's difficult for me to bridge the gap between who I am now and who I was at the time on my mission. But I feel very positively all the same about my missionary experience. And one of the things it was definitely marked by was the sense of spiritual outpouring and miracles, revelations, dream interpretations, all of this kind of stuff that is kind of a big thing in Mormonism, even up to the present time, despite the fact that if you go to a Mormon meeting, a meeting of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in one of its wards that meets every Sunday, you might think, oh my gosh, this is kind of boring. It's like a business meeting, right? You might be used to more charismatic worship where you're at, and you might not think that the people there are being reverent in a way that feels comfortable to you, like my Catholic investigator. But I would say that the charisma that's there, it's there as a holdover from these earlier times. Now I get to John Whitmer, and I take John Whitmer because, all right, whenever you read a primary source and it makes a certain claim, what you want to do is you want to find other sources that are saying something very much like that, right? Now, it may not be exactly that thing, but you're looking for corroboration. And when you get corroborating primary sources, that's when you start to think, okay, there's some history here. This is something that probably happened. Now, it doesn't mean that your work is done and you can just say, oh, well, I understand this thing. That your work has practically just begun. But I think that's when you know, hey, this is a topic that's worth looking into. So here's John Whitmer, and he's describing early Mormon worship like Ezra Booth in the year 1831. Quote, "Some had visions and could not tell what they saw. Some would fancy to themselves that they had the sword of Laban. That was one of the Nephite relics that was passed down through the Book of Mormon. It came from when Lehi and his family at the beginning of the Book of Mormon flee from the environs around Jerusalem. Nephi is commanded by God to slay a wicked man who was trying to murder them. His name was Laban. He found Laban drunk. God commanded him to kill Laban. He followed God's command, even though it was a horrible and very difficult thing to do. And he kept Laban's sword. And Laban's sword in the Book of Mormon became one of the sacred relics of the Nephites living in the New World. So here we have John Whitmer describing this charismatic early Mormon worship in the year 1831. Now, this church was founded in April of 1830, just to give you an idea of how fresh all of this is. The church is founded in April of 1830. Here we're sitting in 1831. This is really early days in Mormonism. And this is what he says he saw. Some had visions and could not tell what they saw. Some would fancy themselves that they had the sword of Laban and would wield it as an expert as a light dragoon. Some would act like an Indian, Native American, in the act of scalping. Some would slide or scoot on the floor with the rapidity of a serpent, which they termed, and this is one that blows my mind, I don't understand it to this day, which they termed, okay, so what are they doing? They would slide or scoot on the floor with the rapidity of a serpent, and they called this sailing in the boat to the Lamanites. Okay, the Lamanites are the apostatized members of the family of Lehi and their descendants who do not follow the Christian teachings of Nephi and his descendants and allies in the New World, preaching the gospel, right? So sailing in the boat to the Lamanites, preaching the gospel. So again, interesting. We're seeing this Native American identity tied together with missionary work, right? That's what's being performed, in a sense, in this charismatic worship. And many other vain and foolish maneuvers. Okay, critical voice, right? He's a negative witness. And many other vain and foolish maneuvers that are unseeming and unprofitable to mention. And this is wild. Thus the devil blinded the eyes of some good and honest disciples. I write these things to show how ignorant and undiscerning children are, and how easy man is led astray, notwithstanding the things of God that are written concerning his kingdom. So here he's weighing in. And so from seeing these things, he moves to a position where he's among the saints, the members of the church, the early Mormons, looking back on these things, wondering, was this actually kosher? Was this of God, or was it of the devil? And they start deciding, maybe some of this stuff was of the devil. And then we get the further remove, of course, that John Whitmer leaves the Mormon church and becomes a critical witness. So anyway, but again, in both of these sources describing worship in 1831, you have early members of the Mormon church emulating, impersonating, taking up what they believe are the behaviors, language, actions of Native Americans in a way that really invokes a scenario of preaching repentance, of missionary work. And I think some of this has to do with preparations to go preach to the Native American peoples around them. It's very hard to preach to someone who's culture is very different from your own. And I've had a little bit of experience with this in the past, but nothing like what this must have meant to, these settlers in North America of European ancestry who were going out and trying to preach their special form of Christianity to the Native Americans around them. That must have been very intimidating. I was, as a missionary, scared to go out and knock doors. And can you imagine what it was like for these guys to go out and preach to the Native Americans? I think it was very difficult. And I think, there wasn't all kinds of success. They didn't experience all kinds of success. Right now, some success, some success, definitely, but not what they had probably initially hoped would be their rate of success. Anyway, charismatic worship in early Mormonism. This is Kish coming to you once again in Coffee with Kish. I hope you enjoyed this little trip. It's not, I wouldn't call it academic history, but it's a taste of what some early sources were saying about charismatic worship in early Mormonism in its very early days, and in a phase that passed. Not that charismatic worship or gifts of the Spirit ever disappeared from Mormonism, but certainly they moderated in their form, they changed style, and now Mormon worship services are much more subdued, I would say, in general, than you get here in these early days. So, Coffee with Kish, thank you. See you next time, and please subscribe.